Some challenges I see when teaching ENL students are time, the students themselves, the state, and parents, and the pressure they inflict on their students. First element is time. And with time, there is never enough. Okay? My class is 38 minutes. Again, I have 13 and 14-year-old students. They can travel to my class from anywhere in the entire school. So by the time they are seated, settled down, and they have the materials out, I've probably lost about already 2 minutes. And that's with really instilling in them a sense of our schedule, so they know what's expected of them when they come into the room. However, again, just as the nature of 13 and 14-year-olds, there are minutes lost at the start of every class in terms of just settling down, getting used to the routine, figuring out what the homework was. Then throughout the course of the period itself, with your daily adolescent interruptions, you're probably going to lose another 3 minutes, and at the end, there are probably the restless kids, which then get everybody else restless. So I would say altogether I probably have about 30 minutes each class. It's such little time. And to establish language objectives, to really get using the academic language, to get involved in really process-oriented writing, that requires much more than I can give on a daily basis. Students, for a lot of my ENL students, they become overly dependent on the teacher, meaning they always want to get the right answer, and it's hard to get them to want to take those educational risks beyond the reach of the teacher. With students also, they can fall back often on their first language, especially when they are in partnerships with somebody else who speaks their native language. As one can expect, their conversation often devolves into L1, and because that's where they're more comfortable. So really trying to get them to move away from their native language. The last challenge with students is that of being disinterested, being disengaged, being unmotivated. And again, these can all be results of just not understanding the language. It's a very hard transition for them. State, the ever-changing state ENL requirements. Right? Oftentimes the state will change something, they leave it up to the school to make flexible arrangements in order to meet those new changes. However, schools such as mine do not want to spend more money on new staffing, and they try to meet the new state standards with current staffing, which is already limited, and resources, which are already limited. This is often to the detriment of the students. So sadly, even though student enrollment is going up, it's not being reflected in the arrangement of the ENL program, at least at my school. Parents and pressure. Again, I've spoken about this before. The predominant culture at my school is either Chinese or Korean, and there are a lot of differences between Asian parenting and Western parenting. Many of my students talk about the difference between an Asian A versus a white A. And these are conversations that I have to bring up in my class. If I give a student a paper, I have to hear my mom won't like that, my mom's going to beat me. I mean, this is very, very hard. So I really want to handle these situations in the most sensitive manner possible. But first I really have to learn about how these students are operating. So I did include some additional resources here. We just have to get them. Up and going. Make this a little smaller so we can see. What's also very hard in this situation, especially with parents, is the idea that if their children are not performing as they should, and if teachers have a question of testing for special education services, this is definitely something that is frowned upon by many of our Asian parents. I know I myself have had a couple of students who have been classified, but the parents have made it resoundingly clear that we are not to tell the child that he or she is classified. So these students move through their middle school career receiving services for something that they are not even aware of being identified for. So altogether, challenges, time, student state, parents, pressure, again, conflicting ideologies, conflicting ways of seeing parenting and the importance of schooling are all things that in my school alone I have to deal with in terms of my ENL program. Some ways that I can address these challenges in my classroom. First one would be the careful planning. So clear objectives, crisp schedule. I really felt this as I was planning with the PSYOPs. Again, really being cognizant of the objectives. So again, objectives, our language objectives, our academic objectives, and trying to make these very clear to the students. Pulling out language, pulling out important pieces of vocabulary, really looking at the lesson from an ENL student's perspective and thinking, where could an ENL student possibly stumble here? And trying to eliminate that obstacle for the student so that the student could have a successful class. Explicit teaching, and then modeling, guided instruction, independent work, moving through, making sure, again, 90 to 100% of the time, student engagement. I think that is a great goal to have as an educator. I think that is a great statistic to have in the back of my brain as I'm planning any type of lesson. Flip lessons, explain everything app, collaborative Google Docs. Learning doesn't always have to take place in the classroom, so setting up learning either via Google Classroom, giving them options to become more interactive with the material outside of the classroom as well. That could capitalize on time. I could pre-teach something the night before, that way when the students come in, it is done and we can discuss it. Assess, assess, assess. Chapter 9 in Paraguay and Boyle talked a lot about this, figuring out what the students are getting. That way I can tailor my teaching. So I'm not losing time with students not understanding what I'm discussing. So the directed reading thinking activities, clustering, going back to vocab strategies, learning logs. Oh, I love the idea of learning logs and journals. Clustering. Having students discuss in partnerships, having them then post answers to the Socrative app, really trying to get a pulse on what my kids know. Make full use of the time I do have. That's really key. So a lot of these strategies should hopefully maximize that 30 minutes or so I have in class each day with them. For students, how can I address the unengaged? How can I address the student who's reluctant to leave his or her native language? Here are some strategies. Scaffold. It was discussed often in our reading. I could do verbal scaffolding, so slowing my speech, enunciating my words, doing paraphrasing. I could do procedural scaffolding, one-on-one teaching. I could do coaching, modeling, small group instruction. I could partnering. Any of those collaborative arrangements would definitely help with scaffolding. Instructional scaffolding, right? We saw this with the PSYOP again. So we can use images, we can use manipulatives. These are all things that will help bring in the student. It's a student interaction, making them discuss, making them use the language, making them have conversations. Engage in cultural dialogue, learning about the culture, having them be a resident expert about a particular holiday or country or ethnicity, giving them a space, making them be heard. Again, clear and slow speech, hands-on activities, concept sorts, things that they can actually physically hold and move around. And I think overall is just compassion. And when teachers are in the 4th month, the 5th month, the 6th month, we have 120 students and students are not performing, it's very easy to get frustrated. But to really pull back, figure out what's going on, and understand that ESL students are going to make mistakes, and that's how we learn best, that's how they learn best. And again, not trying to correct all of those mistakes, pushing for the fluency. Making sure that they feel comfortable knowing that it's okay to be silent, and that they do have space to formulate their own ideas and conversely make their own mistakes. So these are some strategies to deal with time and some of the issues I mentioned about students.